Hello, everybody. Hopefully y'all can still hear me. We'll let people continue getting joined in. Hope you're all doing wonderful on this lovely Wednesday in October as it's starting to get nice and cold outside. Just a few housekeeping things while we get started. As a reminder, we try to keep all of the videos off and muted unless you have a question. If you have any questions throughout, feel free to throw up a hand or throw something in the chat or unmute and ask a question as we go. I am happy to stop and talk to y'all, or else I'm just listening to myself the entire time. And believe it or not, even I find that boring after a while. So any questions at all, feel free to ask. This meeting will count for Master Dairy credit. There is the caveat that please fill out the completion report at the end of the meeting. And I've just thrown that into the chat. And I'll send that out also with the post-completion recording that will come out hopefully later today or the end of this week, depending on how long it takes me to edit the video down and how long-winded I am, I suppose. So thanks for being here today. And we are a little bit after 12, so we will go ahead and get going. Okay, so today we are going to talk about early life calf care. And the purpose of this is so we have a good basis of foundation for how to get our dairy cattle off to the very best start. And what we really find with early life calf care is that this sets the tone for the rest of that animal's life, not just that calf getting up until weaning, but really up and until the remainder of her reproductive viability, her overall growth, and her production in the herd long term. So if we don't set them up for a good start with this next generation, we really can have some difficulties and some train wrecks throughout the rest of their life. So we're going to talk a little bit about pre-calving and preconditioning and what that can do to the calf even before she is out of the dam. We'll talk a little bit about colostrum management, and I'm sure y'all are all familiar with that, but it really is the most important thing that we can do to get these calves off to a good start. We'll talk about pre-weaning feeding and some housing, and then precision technology that we could use to try to augment management and make it a little bit easier on us overall. Success for our calves comes from a variety of factors, and it really does start with genetics, and it starts with how we manage the dam, which is why those two things are on the very top in brilliant blue and grass coloring. We've got to think about what we're breeding in that animal and how do we make a successful mating? And are we trying to set them up for the success knowing, are they going to have less likelihood of health issues later on? Are they going to have a lower chance of somatic cell count? Are they going to be more heat tolerant? So what are we selecting for from the very beginning with that mating? How we manage mom has a lot to do with how well baby will come out and how well baby will continue to grow. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Housing, both from a dam standpoint and from a calf standpoint, are both extremely important. We know environment has a lot to play into how well that calf will actually grow and the ability that they have to get off to the best start. And then management, you are a huge success factor in how well these calves continue to grow and perform. And then there is some that's just down to the calf themselves and how well are they going to do and what advantages are they going to take the opportunity for. Think about pre-calving, preconditioning, particularly in the Southeast, which is where we live. We have to consider heat stress. Heat stress is a huge issue in our state. There really is not an entire month in the year where our dams do not experience heat stress. And there is some great work by Tao and Dahl out of University of Florida looking at the fact that that heat stressed dam, and this is going to be during the dry off period, this is going to be during the close-up period, but really the entire dry period, if they're heat stressed, and heat stressed in Florida was she had access to fans, but didn't have access to sprinklers. And the fans weren't necessarily as high as they could have been. So these dams were still under shelter and still had some fan access, and that was heat stressed. So let's think even more if these cows are out in the back 40 and they don't have access to any kind of heat abatement whatsoever. So there's no trees, there's no rubbery shade structures, plus there's no fans, plus there's no sprinklers. These impacts are going to be compounded. But we saw altered fetal growth. So the calves did not grow as fast and they had reduced birth weight, which would be fine, except that also corresponded to a shortened gestation. So again, that calf isn't getting off to the best start, poor quality colostrum, poor calf immune function, and lower calf weaning weights. So not only did they hit the ground at a lower birth weight, but they didn't gain like we would like them to throughout that entire pre-weaning process. So they started off poorly, they stayed poorly, and they were never really able to make up that overall growth. Even moving beyond that, we saw that with unvaccinated dams, we also see fewer antibodies in colostrum. So that pre-weaning or that pre-calving care of that dam is extremely important to make sure that we have enough of those antibodies in colostrum that that calf has the best chance to fight off anything that gets thrown at it within those first few weeks of life. We also see the same thing with a short dry period. So if we are unvaccinated, if we're heat stressed, or if we have a short dry period, which could come from heat stress, we have poor quality colostrum and potential for impaired fetal growth, which goes back to that same study that we saw from Tao earlier. Building off more of that work with Tao, I'm going to go back just a little bit. Not only did it impact calf growth, but they've carried these studies out further, and it also impacted that calf's first lactation. So she did not grow as well. She was born to lower birth weight. Then even into her first lactation, after we've spent all this time and money getting her bred, keeping her fed, keeping her growing, when it's time for her to start paying us back with milk production, her overall production in that first lactation was lower. And the same thing was true in second lactation animals as well. So these impacts of heat stress dam really do follow that calf throughout her entire life and potentially have some impacts even on her future generations. So heat stress dams, extremely important. Unvaccinated dams, important for that calf in particular, making sure that she has all the antibodies in colostrum, which is our first and best line of defense. And then making sure that when we are breeding these animals, that we are giving them that full dry period, that full 60 days that we know that they need to make sure we have a good quality colostrum and we have all the fetal growth in utero that we need for that calf to hit the ground running. Moving on to colostrum. I know you've all been told colostrum is important. I know you all know colostrum is important, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the science behind why we harp on colostrum just so much in the dairy industry. The main reason to focus on colostrum is because the best defense is a good offense. And this is where that calf is going to get all, not some, but all of her immune protection from dam. Is going to come through that colostrum, through those immunoglobulins. There is no placental transfer in cattle of that passive immunity. It's very different from humans. In humans, we have passive transfer in the placenta, in utero, from our moms to us to protect us when we come into the world and start fighting off any of these bacteria. That's not true for dairy animals or for beef animals for that matter. And it's because of that, the way that the placenta is connected in beef and dairy animals, it's just different from humans. So all of that passive immunity comes from the colostrum, and we can add some protective vaccines to those calves afterwards. But really, we need to focus on the colostrum because that is what is going to protect her for those first several weeks of life before those protective vaccines even have a chance to really get started working. Colostrum is factually different from the rest of the milk, even so much so that in our pasteurized milk ordinance, the only way we can sell it is to say that that milk is practically free from colostrum. And in that first milking following calving, we're going to see twice the dry matter, 3 times the minerals, 5 times the protein, and overall higher in energy, vitamins A and D, and lower in lactose. And that's so it is easier for that calf to digest right off the bat. But the other big thing that we're going to have here that we're not going to see in those other milkings, even as much in the transition milk, is that immunoglobulin content, those IGs. And these IGs are those large proteins that provide protection from the dam to the calf and carry it through for a few weeks. We have 3 cues of colostrum, and they are quality, quantity, and quickness. And I'm sure you've all heard these 3 cues before, but they are vitally important. And when we're looking at our overall quality, we have to have a high quality colostrum. And I know that you've all been told this before, But with that high quality colostrum, we want to make sure that our IgG concentration is high and our bacteria load is low. So it's not an eyeball science. And I have heard people tell me this over and over again. The creamier it is, the higher the IgG concentration. Or the stickier it is on my fingers, the higher the IgG concentration. Or if it looks good coming out of the cow, it's going to be a good concentration. And that is just simply not true. I would love to say that my eyesight is good enough to look through and see microscopic IgGs. It is not. Yours might be, but mine certainly isn't. So because of that, we need to look at tools like colostrometers. And we have a couple different ways that we can look at that. And we also need to look at that standard plate count. But that colostrometer, we have two different ones. We have that Brix refractometer where we will drop a couple drops, drop a couple drops onto that Brix refractometer and see what the percent Brix is, or we can use that old school hydrometer, which changes based on specific gravity. They both work really well. They both give you very clear results. A standard plate count looking at bacterial load, that would be something that I would recommend more if you're having a problem with scours or if we're having a problem with calves just not gaining the way that we think they should. It might be that our bacterial count in our colostrum is fairly high. And if that happens, the first thing that gets to the gut is what's going to inoculate it. And that's going to be that bacteria and not those IgGs, which we want. We've also seen over time that when we need to give this colostrum has kind of changed. It used to be that we thought we had a full day. As long as we get them within a day, we're going to be okay. But really, that's not as true anymore. And this isn't the slide that I'm talking about. I should really look at my graphs before I start talking. So if we're looking at IgGs and passive immunity, this is why colostrum is so important. When we have this passive immunity, it's going to protect that calf really the most around that first day of life. And then it's going to start slowly tapering off till we get to a point where we have this active immune system that's coming in and taking over the job that mom prepped this calf for. But during this period from 1 day out to about 21 days, we have a high risk period where we're going to want to make sure that those calves are kept clean, they're kept dry, they're kept comfortable. So they are in the best stress state to try to fend off any kind of bacterial pathogens. And we want to limit that exposure as much as possible. But with that colostrum, when we're looking at overall concentration, we have the good, the okay, and the absolutely not. And if you were wanting to send bull calves onto the market, even the absolutely not might really not be what we want to feed to those bull calves either, even though at one point that was kind of what we said, it's fine, give it to the bull calves. We probably still want to keep it with that acceptable level if we're planning on keeping these animals and trying to grow them out as steers. Any of your beef on dairy crosses, I would certainly say make sure they get acceptable and not poor. Poor could be, later feedings for those animals. But for our heifers that we're keeping in the herd, we really want to be at that good level. So on the hydrometer, that's this dude, that is going to be anything in green. Green means go. Yellow means red means please don't. Not ever at all with the red. Just feed it to something that doesn't need IgGs. It's not that it's bad, it's that percentage of immunoglobulins in it just is not going to cut the mustard, and those calves are not going to be protected based on that IgG content in the milk. Here are a few other ways that we can look at it. This is going to be a dropper that immediately tells you what kind of immunoglobulin status you have, and that's also going to be in percent Brix. And if we look at this refractometer, I have something very similar that I use for my saltwater tank. Do not get the saltwater one. It will not work. Make sure it is intended for colostrum. And also make sure it's not intended for serum. There are several different refractometers on the market, and you've got to make sure you get one for colostrum or the percent Brix will be completely off. When you look through the colostrometer or the refractometer, what you're going to see is a difference from white to blue, and where those two meet tells you what the percent Brix is at that given time. If you use it and you get a serum one, it will work if you pull a blood sample and check to see what the sera is, that clear part that separates off. It'll work for that. Will not work for colostrum. So make sure that when you get a refractometer, it says it's specifically for colostrum. I will stop beating that dead horse now. Moving on to the next slide. So good heifer calves, acceptable, bull calves, poor. do not feed. Really wanted to emphasize that. Absolutely do not feed that to anyone because it's not going to do any good. It is not going to provide any kind of protective immunity for those calves whatsoever. So we've gone through the trouble of collecting it and testing it, and we know it's not going to do what it needs to. So if you use it, it's going to need to go with some kind of colostrum supplement or colostrum replacer because the IgG content just is not there. If we think about immunoglobulins in the colostrum from the beginning, there are several things that impact it. And one is dam disease history and exposure. So if she's older, if she's seen more things in life, she is going to have more IgGs because her body has more of those immunoglobulins ready to go and on hand. If we have more colostrum, which kind of sounds counterintuitive, if we have a higher volume of colostrum, if that dam just gave a ton, we're going to have lower Ig counts. Kind of think about dilution factor. If she gives more, we're going to get less per volume because she's only creating so many IGs. And if we have seasons of year where it is extremely hot or extremely cold, y'all, this does not happen in Tennessee or Kentucky or North Carolina. We do not get extreme cold, at least not yet. So extreme heat, if those cows are calving when it is extremely hot outside, we are going to expect a lower Ig count. So definitely be sure to always test, but definitely test during these times or when these things are true. Dam age, just like we talked about, that goes back to disease and history and exposure. Younger animals have lower Ig counts. Dam nutrition and dry period length. If she has lower energy and protein, or if she's had less than 3 weeks dry, she's going to have lower immunoglobulins in that colostrum. So paying attention to her nutrition and her dry period length are extremely important. Kind of going back to that overall volume produced, Jerseys have the highest immunoglobulins. They tend to have a lower colostrum amount overall. Holsteins have the lowest immunoglobulins because they tend to have the highest colostrum amounts overall. So it's not that Jerseys are bad and Holsteins are good. It's just the volume of colostrum that they will produce. This does not mean that we don't need to test Jersey milk and that all Holstein or test Jersey colostrum and all Holstein colostrum is bad. It means we need to test and verify. These are just some overall trends in the industry. Because we want to look at that dam's history and that dam's status, we want to focus on vaccinating mom, not baby. It takes a while for that body to build up and respond to those vaccinations, and that's not going to happen as much during that high risk period. If you remember back to that graph that I thought we were talking about something else, if you remember back to that overall graph at the beginning, we have about a 14 to 21 day window where even if we vaccinate at birth, it's going to take that amount of time for that calf to start creating her own antibody responses to anything that she's exposed to, as opposed to that passive immunity from the mom that's going to come in and get them off to a good start once they hit the ground rocking and rolling. And this is just an example of how to vaccinate your animals. I am not a veterinarian. I cannot tell you how to vaccinate, but I strongly suggest reaching out to your veterinarian and coming up with a vaccination schedule for your heifers and your dry animals if you do not currently have one. Some things that are extremely important are things like E. coli, mastitis, and Clostridium vaccinations, rotavirus and coronavirus, again, Clostridium, BVD, BRSV, IBR3, PI3 leptospirosis. All of these are issues that calf may come into contact with during those first couple weeks of life, where having that passive immunity from the dam is really going to set them up for success. So absolutely talk to your veterinarian about getting on a vaccination schedule if that's not already done. With our overall quantity, we're looking at 2 to 3 quarts as soon as possible after birth, and then another 2 to 3 quarts within 8 hours. So really, we could also do 4 quarts ASAP after birth if the calf will take it, but we're going for about 1 gallon of colostrum within 8 hours of life. And that's because we're trying to get that passive transfer of immunity. If that calf will not take a bottle, an esophageal feeder can be used. And some farms, especially larger ones, do use this as a standard management practice. And that's okay. Esophageal feeders are not bad, but you have to know what you're doing, because if you do not hit the esophagus and instead you hit the trachea or the windpipe, like I did earlier today with some coffee that terrified my graduate student because I spewed coffee everywhere because I was choking on it, the calf will choke on the colostrum. So make sure it's going into the esophagus, not going into the trachea. So if you're going to do this, you need to estimate the length of tube needed by measuring the calf's kind of like from the base of her neck down to, about midline in her belly. Position the tube in the esophagus and check that it is in the esophagus, not the trachea. If you feel air coming out of the other end in a breathing motion, it is in the trachea, it is not in the esophagus. Allow liquid into the tube, and gravity can help you out here. And then after you use it, make sure you clean it and sanitize it thoroughly. If it has got any kind of mold, if it's got any kind of milk residue, bacteria will grow on that milk residue and they will be quite happy. If we have any kind of bacteria in the esophageal feeder, guess what is now competing for all of your immunoglobulins going toward the hindgut to be absorbed? All of that bacteria. Same thing if that calves it in a dirty area. Now we are competing with a lot of bacteria that want to go and colonize that gut first, and the bacteria might win, and we really don't want them to. So make sure we clean and sanitize that feeder. Same thing for our bottles, clean and sanitize, because the last thing that we want is for any of that bacteria getting to the gut first. And we have quickness because there's a limited time window of IG absorption. So this is what I started talking about several slides ago, and I thought I was on this one, and I was not. What we have over here on the x-axis is efficiency of immunoglobulin absorption. So how much can that calf absorb? I would like to point out it never goes above 50%. Our very, very, very max is 50% of those IgGs that are available, which is why that IgG content becomes so important. If we have 50% less IgGs, we're only going to absorb half of that amount anyway. So that really eats into our overall passive immunity and getting that calf off to a good start. On average, we're getting about 35% absorption of those IgGs. So we very rarely get up to this 50. Usually we're more at that 35. And we have this lower level down here, which is average absorption of what we're going to see overall. So industry average is really more of that 20, because it doesn't always get immediately fed after birth. And what happens is that gut of the calf will actually start to close over time. And what I mean by gut is when that calf is born, her actual hindgut is able to accept larger proteins after birth. And over time, that ability to accept larger proteins breaks down over time, because we're expecting smaller and smaller proteins to come through, normal digestion. So we don't need to accept these big giant particles. But right after birth, those IgG globulins are much larger than a regular protein that we would think about as far as a food source. And that's why that gut is actually able to accept larger ones. It also makes it a lot easier for bacteria to penetrate that gut and start colonizing it from the get-go, because it's willing to accept larger particles. The further out we get from birth, so we see 0 is when we have the highest potential for absorption. Right around here at 24, that gut is pretty much closed and is not going to accept any more of those large particles. So they're going to get broken down and turn into a food source and not an immunity source. So if we want to get that immune boost, really need to make sure we're feeding within 6 hours, ideally as close to birth as possible, just so that calf is off to the best possible start. If we don't get that colostrum in before the gut closes, what we see is increased illness, increased death in these calves, and impaired growth rates and future production. So we don't get the same amount of production that we would if she had gotten passive immunity at birth. We don't see the same growth weights in those calves as we would have if she got passive immunity at birth. And that's because she physically does not have that immune ability to fight off things that the other calves do. So if you're immunocompromised from the get-go, you're going to get sick more often. You have a higher chance of death. You're not going to grow as efficiently, and you're not going to be able to produce as efficiently, because your body is always worried about those other things that could go wrong because of that immune response. We can guarantee that we have passive transfer by testing serum total protein. And this is what we get back into when we were talking about the other type of refractometer. You can do one for serum total protein. To make sure we've achieved passive transfer, we want to have a serum total protein coefficient of greater than 5.4 grams per deciliter. If we have marginal, we're at 5 to 5.4, and then we're at marginal risk for morbidity and mortality. Morbidity is our fancy word for illness. Mortality is our fancy word for death. If we have a serotonin protein value less than 5, and I want to point out, this is literally a 0.4 difference from we're good to we're bad. We're at high risk for illness and high risk for death. So this is extremely important, making sure that those calves get off to the best possible start and that they get that colostrum, which is why we harp on it so much. I get asked a lot if we can pasteurize colostrum, and the answer is yes, you can pasteurize colostrum, and they sell farm level pasteurizers for this exact reason. And you should be able to use the same kind of pasteurizer you have if you're going to pasteurize bulk tank milk and feed it to your calves. You're going to do it at a lower temperature, so 140, for a longer time, which is 60 minutes. And the reason that we're doing that is if we, that is a great question. When is the time frame to take serum total protein? We'll go back real fast. The best time to take serum total protein is going to be on day 2 or 3 of life. And honestly, you could probably, day 2 or 3 of life is going to be the best time to take serum total protein. And you can do that with a red top tube, and you can pull blood from the jugular, is usually easiest when you're dealing with a calf that small. It's hard for us to hit leg veins on calves. They don't tend to stand super still, and the tail vein is kind of a non-starter on a calf. So red top tube, jugular vein, let it separate naturally. The red cells will coagulate, the serum will separate off on top, and then you can use that colostrometer to test serum total protein. Any more questions on STP? Love it when y'all have questions. Okay. So can be pasteurized, rapidly cooling it, because what we're trying to do is make sure we don't significantly denature the immunoglobulins, but it will reduce bacteria concentrations. And those would be things like E. coli, Salmonella, Mycoplasma, which if we have Mycoplasma in your herd and you know Mycoplasma is an issue in your herd, definitely consider doing colostrum pasteurization, or even something like full colostrum replacement with a colostrum replacer. Not colostrum supplement, that does not replace it. Supplement supplements, replacer replaces. Yes, I know that was a very simple way to say that. But if you have a mycoplasma issue in your herd, if you're seeing a lot of scours, if you're experiencing calf death loss, I would culture some of those samples of colostrum first and see what kind of bacterial counts you're dealing with. And if it's a problem, then consider pasteurizing, just because we're still trying to make sure we get that into that calf within that first 4 hours of life, and pasteurization for an hour will take some time. So this might be a better option if you're pooling and then freezing your colostrum to go through and pasteurize it, or if you're experiencing mycoplasma problems. I was hoping I had this picture in here, and I do. So colostrum cleanliness, we want that low bacteria count in colostrum, less than 100,000. CFU stands for colony forming units per mil. Which is the same thing as 1 cc, if you're thinking about it in shot terms. Biggest things you want to do here is clean the equipment and make sure we have a clean calving and housing environment. What this is what this should look like. This is the microvilli in the intestine of a calf. So we're seeing all these nice little happy microvilli that are standing up straight and are looking for food, and they're just thrilled with life, and they're going to make that a very thrifty and efficient calf. This over here is what happens if E. coli gets to the gut of that calf first. Remember, we talked about that gut being open and able to accept larger particles. This is what happens if dirty things get there first. Those E. coli will actually start to destroy these villi. And you see that now we don't really have the same ability to absorb nutrients from milk replacer. We don't have the same ability to absorb nutrients from water. We don't have the same ability to absorb nutrients from feed that goes through that digestive tract that gets broken down to its component parts. We just don't have the ability to pull that in for this calf, as opposed to this colostrum fed calf over here that had good Ig absorption. That's what these little X's are. These are those larger particles that are the antibodies for the calf. So if we're calving into a dirty environment, it's a race, right? If the first thing she breathes in is, some dirt off of the calving floor that is laden with, poop specks because poop exists in the environment, that's going to be the first thing that gets to the gut. Even if we do feed that colostrum within the first 4 hours, it's a race against time at that point. Same thing with making sure our equipment is clean. If we are sending this beautiful, lovely colostrum through a dirty esophageal feeder or into a dirty bottle and a dirty nipple to go into the calf, it's still a race against time. Which one's going to get there first? Which one's going to colonize first? So cleanliness really next to godliness for this colostrum management thing. So for cleaning, this is going to be really simple. It's like doing your dishes. Wash it in warm water. Wash it with detergent. Try to do an acid rinse or a disinfectant on it after you've washed it, and then allow it to fully dry. This does not mean that you stack all the bottles on top of each other or you leave the bottles with the open end facing up, because things will fall into the bottles and they will not drain and we will get mold. If we stack all of our buckets on top of each other, if we're using a bucket to defrost something later on, or if it's our transfer vessel from, the big bucket from the parlor into the smaller bottle, if that has anything in it, that can colonize that colostrum and start causing issues. So don't stack buckets all on top of each other because water will get trapped. Make sure that when we are draining out our bottles that they are upside down so water can flow out. And make sure that where we are drying our nipples isn't exposed to something like a bunch of, mice running over it, or being around pigeons or cats or anything like that, because whatever gets on that nipple could get into the calf first. For storing our colostrum, we want to make sure we have high quality colostrum on hand, and that's that over 50 milligrams per deciliter version. And we want to either do feeding within 1 hour of collecting, or we want to cool it down below 40, which again makes this pasteurization thing a little tricky for colostrum. So feed within 1 hour of collecting, or immediately put it in the refrigerator. Absolutely do not leave it out at room temperature. Milk grows bacteria extremely well. Every 30 minutes that colostrum is at room temperature, the bacteria population will double. This is also true for thawed frozen colostrum. Every 30 minutes it's out at room temperature, those bacteria counts double. Even if we only start off with 10,000 colony forming units of E. coli, even if we only start off with 100, it's going to go from 100 to 200 to 400 to 800 to 1600, and it will just continue growing over time. If we do refrigerate it, we don't want to leave it in the refrigerator longer than 1 day, 24 hours after collection, because again, those bacteria populations will continue growing at a slower rate, but they are still growing. If we freeze colostrum, we really don't want to keep it for longer than 1 year, and that's because we can start to lose some actual protein integrity after that 1 year period. So in 2 years, it's no longer going to be high quality colostrum. In 1 year and 6 months, it's probably not going to be high quality colostrum anymore either. So make sure that you date all of your frozen colostrum and you put the initial colostrum quality on it as well, so you know when you need to go through that inventory. For defrosting colostrum, we want to defrost it slowly. We do not want to shock it from frozen to lava hot, because we will denature all of those proteins that are those immunoglobulins. And if we do that, we're not really feeding that calf what it needs. So warm water, not hot. If you can't keep your arm in it comfortably, it is too warm. Think almost human baby bottle level. We do not want to scald these immunoglobulins, because extreme heat destroys antibodies. Now that I've said that, you can use a microwave, but you want to do it for short periods, like less than 20 seconds, probably like 10 seconds at a time, with a rotating turntable. So it will still take a while with the microwave, but you can use it if you need to. Colostrum replacement does in fact replace colostrum, but it's still not a substitute for good quality colostrum directly from the dam, for a couple reasons. And that's because that dam has antibodies for what's endemic to your environment. What those calves are going to see, that dam is already naturally producing. It's usually a whole lot cheaper to get colostrum from your cows and even go through all of this testing than it is to purchase in colostrum replacement. It tends to be pretty pricey. And making sure that you use a replacer and not a supplement is extremely important if you were trying to, in fact, completely replace colostrum. Colostrum replacer has more antibodies than colostrum supplement. No shocks there. It's supposed to completely replace it, not support it. Colostrum replacer has more antibodies than poor or moderate maternal colostrum. So again, if you're having problems with calf death or calf illness, this could be something to look at. Test what you got first. See if you can fix the problem at home first, and then move to a colostrum replacer or a colostrum supplement if it's needed. Colostrum supplement should be added to maternal colostrum, but will still not meet high quality colostrum performance. So really, if you can grow it at home better than you can buy it, that's what I would do, because that maternal colostrum that's good quality is always going to be your best bet. Colostrum replacers are also not all created equal. This is also true for milk replacers, not all created equal. You want to make sure that in any colostrum replacement that you buy, you're actually getting the bang for your buck. You need greater than 100 grams of IgG per dose. And that needs to be either plasma, which would be blood IgG derived, or a lacteal derived, which would be milk derived immunoglobulins. This is where they have to be from. And the nutrient content needs to mirror maternal colostrum. So go back and look at that slide from the very beginning, and I'll send these out afterwards. Those are the nutrient profiles you're trying to match. The pros are that it's consistent supply. It's always the same. You're never not going to know what you're getting if you purchase in colostrum replacement. And it can be advantageous in herds that have a Johne's problem or herds that have a mycoplasma problem that can invest in pasteurization, because then you know you're not inoculating this next generation with Johne's or with mycoplasma. Having health protocols is a super important part of calf care, but they do not outweigh poor quality colostrum. So the main thing you can do is test colostrum. Yes, I'm going to keep saying it. Sorry, y'all, just get used to it. Next thing to do is dipping navels and making sure that we have some kind of protection against that navel to help protect the calf from anything coming in through that navel, and then also helping dry out that umbilical cord. You can administer things like IBRPI3 intranasal vaccines, but that is not going to protect the calf from the get-go, especially if we do have passive transfer of immunity, which is what we're going for. That is the most important part of this whole calf thing with colostrum. If we do our job and we get passive transfer, we're going to actually have some natural resistance to immunizations for 2 to 3 weeks following birth, which means that if we give them a vaccine, whether it is by a shot or whether it's intranasal, it's not going to have the same efficacy as if we didn't have passive transfer. And again, the goal is passive transfer. So if we can cut out some of these things because we have a good colostrum program, we're spending less money on that initially. Now, again, talk to your veterinarian before making any changes, but these are just some of the science behind the recommendations that we have. Like I said, passive transfer is the goal. If we do give any kind of vaccinations at birth, there's a couple different things that we could do. And one is administering an oral antibody product. And those usually target E. coli and coronavirus. And we need to give them within the first 12 hours of life, but they're not really effective until day 3 to day 5. Because again, that body's got to start producing antibodies of its own to the E. coli and to the coronavirus. We could vaccinate with an oral modified live rotavirus or coronavirus, and we need to do that 30 to 60 minutes before feeding colostrum. Again, because we are trying to have that get to the gut first. If the colostrum gets there first, it's going to colonize that gut, and we're not going to be able to have these impacts with this oral antibody. They're not effective until day 5 or 7, but they will outlast passive immunity. So if you're going to do something, think about this oral modified live rotavirus coronavirus, because it should pick up after passive immunity is done from mom. Pre-weaning feeding, and this is where we're going to think about things like milk, grain, water, and potentially hay. With milk feeding, we can either do bottle or bucket feeding. And with that, I think a lot of that is personal preference. I haven't found a ton of literature that suggests one is better than the other. If you prefer feeding with a bottle and you think it's more natural, absolutely go for it. If you prefer feeding with a bucket, just make sure all of your stuff is clean and your calves are actually getting enough of the milk overall. Whole milk, you can do bulk tank or waste milk. There are definitely some concerns with waste milk. We'll talk about that on the next slide. With milk replacer, if we have calves that are less than 4 weeks of age, which we absolutely will if we're feeding milk replacer, we want to make sure that we're feeding them an animal protein-based product, which are going to be those more expensive milk replacers. Calves actually can't really break down the protein from plant-based protein products before 4 weeks of age. So we are spending still money on milk replacer that calf really isn't able to fully utilize. So over 4 weeks of age, if you want to go with a plant-based protein milk replacer product, I'm all for it. Under 4 weeks of age, you're just not doing yourself any favors. You're actually costing yourself in the long run. We want to make sure that we pay attention to fat and protein in this milk replacer. It needs to mimic what that cow is naturally producing. If we feed waste milk, or even if we feed bulk tank milk, there are some disease risks, and those are primarily going to be Johne's, Salmonella, E. coli, BBD, Pasteurella, and Mycoplasma. Pasteurization of waste milk or bulk tank milk reduces these risks. And you're going to see that our pasteurization time is actually a little bit higher, temperature is a little bit higher and our time is a little bit shorter. So if we're doing vat pasteurization, which would be those vats that you can purchase and actually keep in the bulk tank room, that is going to need to be at 145 degrees Fahrenheit for 30 minutes. You could use that same vat for pasteurizing colostrum if you wanted to, making sure that you put it at 140 degrees Fahrenheit and hold it in there for an hour for that 60 minutes. I don't think any of y'all are going to need something like a high temp short time pasteurizer. That would be more continuous. It does basically flash pasteurize it, but they're fairly expensive pieces of equipment. And unless you were feeding gobs of calves every single day, it's just probably not a good financial investment. But the batch pasteurizer can be really good if you're going to feed any waste milk or bulk tank milk, just to add that extra layer of protection for your calves. Some additional waste milk risks, they tend to have an inherently higher bacterial count. It's coded waste milk for a reason. There's a possibility of ingesting antibiotics and potentially some antibiotic resistance. And then there's also a concern of pre-inoculation, particularly with some things like Staphylococcus aureus. If you know you have Staph aureus cows in your herd and you're throwing away Staph aureus milk, if those calves ever cross-suckle or even suckle themselves, they can actually start to pre-inoculate those immature teats. So when she does calve in, you guessed it, she calves in with Staph aureus. So some real true risks to waste milk that's not pasteurized. Our OG conventional wisdom with calf feeding was we wanted to limit feed to drive grain intake. And that really is more of an economic driver, not a nutritional or a biological one. So what we need for maintenance of a 90-pound calf, this is just maintenance. This is staying alive. For maintenance of a 90-pound calf plus small gain, we're going to get that out of about a pound of 2020 milk replacer. And we can see that right here. We need at least 1.1 pounds a day to be able to get half a pound of gain. And that's just over staying alive. We need 0.84 pounds of milk replacer per day for that calf to just live. So what we really need is 1 to 2 pounds of whole milk for every 10 to 12 pounds of body weight for that animal. And usually that turns into 25 to 26% protein, 29 to 30% fat for that milk replacer. And if we're looking at Holstein birth weight, again, this is birth weight, this is not gain that's happening after that. For an 80 to 100 pound calf, we're looking at 8 to 16 pounds of milk every day, which translates to about 2 gallons. A gallon is 8 pounds, 2 gallons is 16 pounds. And that's where we would need to be to meet 1 to 2 pounds of whole milk for every 10 to 12 pounds of body weight. And that would need to adjust over time to allow for increased growth. If we think about how much that calf can actually hold, this is a question that we get asked if we feed a full gallon, if we feed a couple of gallons every feeding, she is going to overflow her abomasum and she is going to get pneumonia and die. Well, this is looking at the abomasum where that milk is going to go before intake. This is very empty. This is 2 quarts. This is 4 quarts. This is 6 quarts. This is 1.5 gallons. That abomasum expands and can actually take probably a little bit more than this 1.5 gallons of milk that we see in this one. But we can feed 6 quarts to that calf, no problem. That abomasum will expand. In the same study with these different bottle-fed calves at about 3 weeks old, there was no difference in scours, stomach pain, or diarrhea for the calves fed 2 quarts, the gallon, or the gallon and a half at each feeding. So we really can do this and not cause downstream negative effects. For our milk replacer, we are trying to get 18 to 22% protein. If we're doing intensive feeding, what we're going to see is we're increasing that protein amount offered. And we can either do that by increasing concentration of the milk replacer or increasing the amount that we're feeding. And they're not all created equal. Like we talked about before, plant-based just does not have the same ability for that calf to actually break it down and use it effectively. So that milk protein is absolutely queen. Water is extremely important. It is required to digest feed. If we do not have water, these calves cannot utilize the grain that we're giving them. Milk and milk replacer actually bypass the rumen via the esophageal groove, so they never go in there in the first place. So if we're trying to get rumen development, if we're trying to get that calf to go off of milk at some point in its life, we have to have water and we have to have some kind of grain. We want to make sure that fresh, clean water is available because that will increase body weight gain. It's a very cheap way to increase rates of gain, and starter intake and reduces weaning age. All of these are good things for the pocketbook. And we really want to make sure they're consuming 8 to 10 quarts of water per day at weaning. So whatever they were consuming with milk, we're trying to fully replace that with water by the end of that weaning period. Calf starter has got to contain 18 to 20% crude protein, and the calves have to want to eat it. They've never seen it before. This is a novel feed source that we're trying to get them to consume over and above what they're already getting from their nutrition from the milk replacer. We really don't want to limit them too much on milk replacer because then we're relying on, grain to come in and take over just staying alive at those higher weights. And we want them to continue growing throughout that weaning period. What we could do is a whole, coarsely ground, cracked, crushed, rolled, steam flaked, or texturized grains. There's a lot of options, basically, is what I'm saying for this feed, but it has to be attractive. We don't want it to be dusty. We don't want it to be too hard. We don't want it to be too soft. It really is the Goldilocks zone, and we do not want fines. We're trying to create this rumen environment, and those fines, they're dusty. The calves really don't like them. They're not palatable to calves at that age. And ideally, we'd like some kind of molasses or molasses-like product to trick the calves into eating the starter. It's kind of like putting cheese on your broccoli. You want your kids to eat the broccoli, you trick them with cheese. We want the calves to eat the starter, we're tricking them with molasses. Please eat the candy and the good stuff that it is coating. We really do have to have grain. We want that free choice grain starting about 3 days of life. And this is why. So these calves were not ever fed grain. And this is the rumen at 6 weeks. We don't have any rumen papillae. We want it to look like this. We don't have a thick rumen wall, and we don't have overall rumen growth. And this is what we're going for. This rumen is what's going to let them break down all of that TMR or all of that grass or all of that hay. So getting it off to the best possible start is really what we need to have in these calves. And we want to start small. If you're filling a bucket with grain at day 1 of life and hoping that they'll eat it down, they're not gonna, because it's going to get moldy, it's going to get stale, it's going to get moist, it's going to do all of these things that no longer make it a palatable feed, and they're just not going to eat it. So start off with, a handful or less than a handful in that bucket. Once they start eating that, add more and more and more as you go. 1, it's going to save you money because you're not putting in a whole bunch of feed that you have to throw away. And 2, it's actually going to increase their intake over time, because as it disappears, there's that whole feeling of, oh, hey, but I want some more of that, candy coated stuff. Hay is a tricky one. When they're less than 8 weeks old, you're really just feeding them money because this is the rumen. It really grows based on grain. It doesn't grow based on hay. So in that same study that I showed you earlier, if those calves were fed hay, all it really did was stretch the rumen out. It didn't really help develop it or grow it in any way. It just made it bigger. And that's really not what we're going for, because there's no papillae in there to absorb anything that's in that rumen. So over 8 weeks old, I'm all for it. Under 8 weeks old, you're better off putting straw in there for them to lay on than hay in there for them to eat. Over 8 weeks old, we need it, and we absolutely have to have it by 10 to 12 weeks old. And we're going for a high relative forage quality hay or relative feed quality hay, 125 to 135. Protein, it's okay for it to be below 22%, and actually anything over that, we'd probably be a little bit concerned. Because they're not a full ruminant, they can't really use that protein yet. So we can see some scours and actually mimic coccidiosis if our protein is actually a little bit too high in this feed for the calves, the hay for the calves. And like always, I talked a really long time, so we'll go through feeding strategies and housing pretty quick and then leave some time for questions at the end. We could do accelerated, group, or automated feeding, and there's not really a right or a wrong option for this. It really is what works best for your situation. For accelerated feeding, we can see some gains, and that's because we're actually giving them more energy. So if we give them more feed to actually turn over and convert into growth and not just maintenance, we're going to see a little bit more gain on these calves overall. And that's what we're seeing here with these different levels with the high milk and low milk amount. So triangles, high milk, squares, low milk. We don't really see that big drop off around weaning either that we see with the low milk amount, because they're already used to trying to provide that energy in different ways. With group housing, we can see dry matter intake and average daily gain increase with paired calves. So if you want to put them in 2s instead of in 10s or 5s, you can actually see some of those same benefits by just putting them with a buddy instead of putting them with everyone. Group housing can prevent stress because we see no difference in health or better outcomes from several different studies that have been done, and they're actually able to adjust to novelty a little bit quicker. This was done with a ball and a buzzer, and I would love to tell you more about that later because it was a really interesting study. But we do see that small groups are better. So we don't want to get too large, and really group and pair housing yield the same results. So unless you're really strapped for space, I would just put them with a buddy and let them grow with a buddy during this period of time, because they're going to get all the same benefits, and you're not quite so concerned about which calf is sick, which calf is scouring, because you can pick it out between 2 a lot easier than you can between 10. With group housing, we do have some concerns. So things like cross-sucking, if we see that, increasing our milk feeding is a really good initial option, or providing alternatives to suckling. So something like old nipples, or maybe an old mob feeder that they could just nurse on throughout the day and have some oral stimulation. We can be concerned about disease outbreaks, and they absolutely require intensive management. You cannot leave calves alone in a group housing scenario and just hope everything is going to go well. You're going to have to be out there looking at them, making sure you know which calf might have an issue, which calves don't have an issue, and try to prevent them from spreading. Now it's herd management, but on a much younger scale. When we did a feeding and housing study here in Tennessee, we looked at a couple different things. We either had a standard milk diet or a high milk diet for a calf by themselves, or a standard milk diet that was an individual calf that was paired with somebody else. When we looked at that, those cows that were fed the double amount, which is going to be that high milk diet, actually outperformed the control cows or the cows that were paired. So it could be something where we're just going to start looking at those impacts of intake and not so much those impacts of paired housing. But we do see some impacts of paired housing as well, where they're performing a little bit better. With automated feeding, there's a couple options. We've got mob feeders, calf rail systems, or automated milk feeders. With automatic milk feeders, I am a fan of these systems, but you have to manage the system. So it is one more thing to manage. I wouldn't jump straight into an automatic milk feeder if there are any problems currently with calf health and calf management. I'd figure out those issues first and then move into something like an automatic feeder. You can do individualized feeding in a group setting because we literally have ear tags that are tuned to these auto feeders. And you can use either replacer mixed with water, or you can use whole milk. Either of these will work in this system. And you get more information. So number of visits, total amount consumed. And if you pay to have a weigh floor installed, you can actually get daily weights on these calves as well. If you're transitioning to an automatic feeder, there are still some general keys for management. We want to feed those calves individually for the first week to 2 weeks of life, and that's really to make sure that there are no issues. And that would be true in a group housing scenario or a paired housing scenario as well. Take care of them one-on-one for the first week to 2 weeks and then move them together. And we wouldn't want to keep the groups larger than 25 is really the max. And there's some competing information out there from other sources, but smaller the better. And we want to have at least 2 nipples per group for the same reason that we want to have at least 2 waterers per pen if we're talking about our adult cows. We want to make sure they're not competing for this resource. We do want to pay attention to ventilation. This isn't necessarily something that we always have to think about with all of our calf housing systems, but if they're indoor, pay attention to ventilation and make sure we don't overcrowd the area. So we want to make sure we have enough nipples for everyone, and we also want to make sure we have enough square footage per calf. So that 28 square feet is extremely important. And because there's less individual time with a single calf, they do require excellent calf management and excellent technology management. It will become information overload if you're not careful. And this is probably one of the last real things I want to hit on, because I get asked this question a lot about calf temperature and at what temperature do we need to start doing things like providing calf jackets. And y'all, I looked in a bunch of spots, lots of spots, to try to find information on when we needed calf jackets. And the best recommendation I found for calf jackets actually came out of Wisconsin and said, when the ground is frozen, you probably need to put a jacket on your calf. We don't really get frozen ground in Tennessee. It might happen for like a day, and then we're probably good. Or we have some weird freak weather event where the ground is frozen. Calves' thermal neutral zones are still lower than ours as humans. At birth, they are happy from 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So they can tolerate a little bit warmer, but they can also tolerate a little bit cooler. So when I'm chilly and I need my jacket, that calf absolutely does not. Her happiest temperature is 70, but they will be okay down below 50. If it's hotter than 80, which it frequently is in Tennessee, if it's hotter than 80, provide more water. That is going to be the best mechanism to help them regulate their own temperature. And then if we have any kind of options to ventilate a hutch or continue to move air through a barn, those can be good too, but we absolutely don't want to cause a draft on those calves. If it is less than 45 degrees outside consistently or on that day, best things we can do is provide a little bit more milk or milk replacer, give them some more calories to help them fight off the cold, and potentially provide some hay to nestle in when it's below 45 degrees for most of the day. So more than that in Tennessee, we're probably really not going to need. Calf jackets, like I said, if the ground is frozen, this will be needed. We don't really have that in Tennessee. So when in doubt, give more milk replacer and provide hay for them to nestle in. Don't go straight for the calf jacket because it can actually cause some heat stress issues more than it can fix issues with cold stress. And with that, I'm going to skip to the end, and we went a little bit too far for that, just so that we can give a few minutes to talk about any questions that we might still have. Questions, comments, cries of outrage. Don't forget to do the completion survey. I know that was a lot that I threw at you. Any other questions? I know we talked about serum total protein. Anyone completely disagree with me on the calf jacket question? What did I say about pounds of milk powder? Okay, I think I know which spot you're talking about. What I was saying about overall milk powder was to make sure that we fed enough to overcome just keeping calves alive. So if we look at calf growth, we're usually trying to go for something like a pound of growth per day. You're welcome, Haley. I understand if you have to drop off. To get no growth, so just stay alive. And this is assuming a 90-pound calf, which is about average for a Holstein birth weight, we need 0.8 pounds per day of milk replacer just to keep that calf alive, or the equivalent of, milk production from that, from the bulk tank, which would be something along the lines of this whole milk over here. So if we're thinking about a gallon of milk a day, we're probably thinking about that pound of milk replacer a day. And that would just be to keep them alive at the beginning. If we're trying to get any kind of growth out of these animals using milk replacer, we have to allow for a higher amount of milk replacer. So if we're going for alive and a pound of gain a day, we're looking more at 1.5 pounds of milk replacer per day to be able to get that growth in that animal. And I think most of the standards, if we think about like the cup that we're pulling out of the bag of milk replacer, a lot of that is set more at the just staying alive level than it is at the actual alive plus 1 pound of gain a day. Does that help? Clear as mud? So I am standing at the chat to see if there's any more comments. Well, either Matt found it unhelpful or he was like, meh. If I have already collected colostrum, is there a benefit of feeding the milk I am dumping until she can be milked in the tank? So is there a benefit to feeding it for a few days? How can we achieve, okay. For the first question about colostrum, I don't know that there's necessarily a health benefit to it from an IgG standpoint, but if we look at how colostrum is a little bit different in overall requirements, we see that we have higher solids, higher protein, and then our fat actually drops off pretty quickly. And this is first, second, and third milking. So this isn't necessarily days. This is the first time we milk her out, the second time we milk her out, and then the third time we milk her out. So we see that that drops off actually pretty quickly after production. But yeah, I mean, it could be good feed for them. Just make sure it's not something that you're feeding them first. But cheaper on the pocketbook for sure, because you're feeding it instead of dumping it. How can we achieve the 2 pounds per day? Well, you can either go back over to, I know everyone's going to get brain strain looking at this. One of the options that you can do is actually just feed more. If we think about accelerated feeding, that's kind of the plan behind accelerated feeding, is that we are giving them more milk and more access to milk than we would beforehand. Or were you asking how do we get to 2 pounds of gain per day, Matt, before I figure out which question I'm answering? And the answer to both is really going to be the same, and that's going to be more milk or more milk replacer, and then making sure that they have access to water and then access to a palatable grain is going to be the answer to both of them. You could put more powder and less water and increase the fat and protein amount that way. Where is that? Thought I had it on here somewhere. Yeah, so if we're looking at intensive feeding, it's kind of like another half. So it would be 1 plus half again of what you were feeding to those calves. So check on the milk replacer bag, look at the actual cup, and then add half of that back into it. So 1.5 instead of 1 is going to get you up to this intensive feeding level of 28 to 30% protein. And that's going to help create, like, bridge that gap of not having enough protein there to have those building blocks for increased average growth. And then checking again, making sure you're not feeding a plant-based milk replacer right off the shot, because those calves can't really break down that protein yet. So spend the extra money, get the higher quality colostrum that's animal protein based, and that will help with that too. Any more questions? What amount of intake for milk should I strive for on a robot feeder? That is a great question. And it doesn't have to be your last one. Just want to make sure I don't jump off before y'all are done asking questions. For the robot feeder, they do have some good metrics from the robot feeders of what we want to go for as far as intake goes. Absolutely, Amy, I will send out a copy of the video recording to everyone afterwards, and I'm happy to send these slides out as well. You're still really going for that same amount of intake, and for most of your calves, especially when they're transitioning to the milk feeder, I honestly would do the ad libitum amount. They're going to kind of limit themselves on when they're done with eating for the day. And if we look at this information back from the accelerated feeding group from Borderis back in 2009, with ad lib milk production or milk potential, they never really went over 2 pounds of milk per day. That was kind of where they stopped, instead of just getting 1 gallon of milk per day. Or that was growth. Sorry, that's average daily growth. I'll go back and check this study and see how much they actually took in with ad lib, but it wouldn't break the bank to keep it on ad lib and just let those calves continue to have as much as they want. You might ask, depending on which type of automatic feeder you have, you might ask and see if they have any literature from that company specific to it, or we can talk more about it after this presentation if you tell me which kind you have, and I'll go do some digging and get back to you. Any more questions? If you have a last one, Matt, I won't mind. All right. Well, thank you all. I appreciate the questions at the end, and thanks for sticking with me. I know we're a few minutes after 12 or 1, definitely a few minutes after 12. I hope y'all have a good rest of your day, and I'll get this out to you shortly. Thanks.